All right, this is Max Headspace 9mm, and today we're going to talk about trigger mechanics. Now, the trigger on a gun is a very complex thing. It is designed to do certain things so that you can use it very, very well. There's several different parts to the way a trigger works, most triggers anyway. Pistol triggers are generally some of the better triggers. But lately, a lot of these pocket pistols, these defensive guns, a lot of these .380 pistols really don't have very good triggers. Unfortunately, they are a huge compromise for the purpose of safety. If you have one of those and that's what you're target shooting with, you're going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage because they oftentimes have a 10-pound or more trigger pull on them, and that just makes it a little more difficult to do a good trigger press. But maybe you'll get an opportunity to shoot with a different gun, and even if you do have one of these pocket pistols with a really heavy trigger, you can still learn to use it very well and shoot very accurately. All right, once you've got your grip mechanics down and you've got that grip squeeze properly wired in, the next step, the next exercise for you to do is to isolate the muscles. The gripping muscles have to be isolated from the trigger muscles. All right, now that is really crucial because gripping a gun is very different from pressing a trigger. Gripping a gun is kind of a force. Pressing a trigger is a very subtle and gentle thing. You don't yank the trigger, you don't jerk the trigger, you squeeze the trigger. Triggers are designed to be squeezed, and once you get the idea of how a trigger works, you will begin to understand there's a lot more going on here than you realized before. So here's an exercise. Once you get your grip, you're squeezing the gun reasonably tightly, but not so tightly it's uncomfortable. Holding it in the proper aiming position, take your trigger finger, go in the trigger, out, in, out, in, out. So maintain your squeeze on the grip of the gun and do an independent kind of thing with your trigger finger. This is a way for you to learn how to isolate those muscles, and you're going to teach your hands to do very different things with the different muscle groups. So the trigger on a Glock 26 is pretty standard. It's not the greatest trigger in the world, and it's not the worst trigger in the world, but one thing it does very well and that I really like is when it is to the rear, this gun has not been cocked. Now notice as I rack the slide, the trigger comes forward. That gives you a tactile feeling that yes, this gun has the spring tension in the striker under tension. The last little bit of pull on this trigger will do the last little bit of loading of that striker spring and then release it. Now, I'm going to go over on this side so you can see a little bit better. Now here's what a trigger does. Of course, you have your safety, which is that first little blade on the front of the trigger. The trigger will not move back unless that is depressed. That's kind of like a locking mechanism. It unlocks it when you press it back. Now on this particular gun, there's not much play. You're actually under load right from the start. Some guns have a nice little bit of play that has no load whatsoever. It's a very, very light amount of trigger movement. But this one has a little bit of weight to it right from the start, and as you move the trigger backwards, you come up against a stacking of the spring. It's getting increasingly tense until you begin to feel it's stacking up, getting a little more resistant, and then it breaks right there. Now here's what you want to do. If you want to be good with your trigger mechanics, as soon as the gun fires, you keep the trigger held back. A lot of times people have a tendency, especially when they're new to shooting, to let go because they don't even know what's going on. Their nervous system takes over. They just heard a really loud bang, the gun just jumped in their hands, and so it's like some kind of a rabid animal, and they want to let go of it. It's just primal nature. But a good shooter that is used to triggers and how they work will maintain the rearward squeeze all the way through the cycling of the action. It's held to the back. Now, the beginning of the next shot that you're going to fire is the release until you get to that click. Now, do you see how short a movement that was? It's very, very short. And it's a lot less pressure to pull back. And that's your next shot. Let's do that again. Okay, the gun fired. My finger is still holding the trigger to the back, to the rearward of the trigger guard. And I'm ready to aim and take my next shot. I am easing up until I get that click, which you feel and usually hear, even with your hearing protection on. And you begin to squeeze in a rearward direction until you come up against the break. Now, the thing about that is, you might have noticed, my finger was not traveling very far at all. It wasn't going like this. It was almost not moving. Just moving the tiniest little bit, almost imperceptibly. See, that's not much. And if you realize how little your trigger finger really needs to move, you begin to realize, okay, I can squeeze this thing really tight, maintain my grip, and do very, very little trigger movement. I have a tremendous amount of sensitivity in that trigger finger, while I have a tremendous amount of brute force holding the grip. So I have a very sensitive trigger finger and a very powerful rest of my hands holding the grip. That is the way you press a trigger correctly. The thing about this practice that's so important, and is really a kind of a surprising thing, is it is the tendency of most people, because this thing is going to explode in their hands and do a loud bang, our muscles and our nerves begin to get used to that. And as a result, we anticipate. We know about where that trigger is going to break, and so we'll clamp down. We'll anticipate the recoil, so we might jerk a little bit. That's one of the biggest enemies to accuracy you're going to find. And that is why this exercise is so important. A lot of really, really good pistol shooters will spend more time with this drill than they will actually shooting on the range. And the reason is they get used to the trigger stacking and tripping the sear and feeling that click without the gun jerking their nervous system. So that when you go to the range, you want to actually be kind of surprised by it, but not alarmed. There's something about the nervous system that anticipates something scary, something, I know shooting a gun is not scary, but there is something very shocking and jarring to the nerves in your hand. And as a result, most people, through no fault of their own, will jerk at the very last minute when they're pulling a trigger in anticipation of that shot being fired. This exercise, practiced over and over and over again, 100 times a day wouldn't be bad. Shoot this target in your living room with no ammo more times than you shoot at the range. You'll become a really, really good shot that way, because you'll be able to hold the gun steady. You'll be able to press the trigger until it trips the sear without learning to jerk the gun. It's not that hard to hold steady when you realize that the gun doesn't have to be something that frightens you or scares you or jerks your nervous system around. When you get used to that and you begin to diminish your fear of the gun, then you go out to the range and you shoot it with real bullets at a target, you begin to relax a whole lot more, because you realize you are actually in control of this thing. Not only psychologically, but neurologically. That's a very important thing. Neurological understanding of the weapon is what you're training here. You want your hands, your arms to not feel threatened at all by this shock that's going to happen to them. And that is why you train in your home, pressing the trigger at a target with no rounds in the gun. All right, next week we're going to talk about stance a little bit more and keep practicing. This is Max Headspace 9mm saying have a good one.